I'm going to show you how to access the Federal Reserve Economic Data website, FRED, and get data to complete the problems in the Data Exploration section at the end of each chapter in the textbook. I'm going to work problem 5 in the Data Exploration section at the end of chapter 1. Problem 5 says, plot on one figure the percent change from a year ago of both the GDP deflator, FRED code GDP-DEF, and real GDP, FRED code GDP-C1. The first thing I need to do is go to FRED. I'm using Google Chrome. I'm going to type FRED, and then I'll type economic data just to make sure. FRED comes up near the top, at the top. It's the St. Louis Fed. I'll click on that. I've already joined FRED, so it brings me up signed in. You can go ahead and join by creating an account. It just needs your email address and a password, and you can join for free. I'm going to search on the FRED codes. I have GDP-DEF, so I'll put GDP-DEF. Press enter. And it gives me the gross domestic product implicit price deflator. So I'm going to export that data. I'll use the export tab. I'm going to export to Excel. There's the GDP deflator data. That's FRED graph 7. You might want to go in and change that name. I'll just remember that 7 is the GDP deflator. Then I'll go up to my search here. I will select the next FRED code, which was for real GDP, which was GDP-C1. Press enter. And it gives me that. I want to export that to an Excel file, and that's FRED graph 8. I have opened a blank Excel workbook. I want to put some values in that workbook. First of all, I'm going to create a sheet for my real GDP, and then I'll create a sheet for GDP that's been deflated. Double click there, GDP def. I'll go ahead and get the real GDP data. I'll go back to Google. FED graph 8 is the real GDP, so I will open it. I don't need to enable it for editing. I'm not going to do any editing on this sheet. I'm just going to copy this data. So I'm going to place my cursor here on the first date, hold down the Shift key, move over to the column of numbers, end, down arrow, select them all, then do Control-C, copy that data, go to my blank workbook, RGDP, and on line 4, I'm just going to paste that in there. Control-V will paste it. You can see that Excel has read these date values and interpreted them as dates. So I'll enter these as quarterly data, so I'll label that quarter, and that is GDP C1. All right. Now I'm going to go get the other data, so go back to Chrome, and I'll go ahead and open 7, which was the GDP deflated. Again, I'll just copy that data. Hold down my Shift key, right arrow key to select the next column, press and release the N key while still holding down the Shift key. Press and release the down arrow. That selects everything. I will copy that. Control C. Go to my new Excel workbook. Go to the tab for deflated GDP. Place my cursor in A4. Control V to paste. Double click to expand that cell. And I have my quarter and GDP def. Zoom in a little so you can see that. I'm going to create my graph on this workbook. So on my graph, I'm going to want to show years as labels on the horizontal axis. So I'm going to click on the B column, right click, and select Insert, Insert column of values, and this will be the years. And I'm going to go get the year portion from the date. Excel interpreted this as a date value. As you can see, I get an odd-looking value here. That's because Excel is interpreting 1947, which is the year. It's using the format here, which is a year format, and it's saying 1947 is 1,947 days from January 1, 1900. I'm going to change the format. I don't want this as a year. I just want the number with no zeros. Now it sees it as 1947. And if I move my cursor to the autofill node and double click, it will copy that formula all the way down and indicate the years for each value. So now I have what I need to label the horizontal axis of my graph. Now I need to create the values for comparisons. You'll notice that the GDP deflated value here is really not comparable to this value here, the real GDP. So I'm going to convert this to indicate the change in the value. We do this a lot. We're going to do this in these first several chapters and throughout the text as it's required to. So I'm going to compare previous periods. I'm going to calculate the change or the growth or decline of GDP. So I'll create a column here called growth. I'm going to go ahead and start. I need a full year's worth of data to start, so I have to start in the second year. So I go to the first quarter of 1948. What I want to do is take the current year minus the previous year and then divide that quantity over the previous year, and that will give me the percentage growth. So I'll put in my equal sign. I'm going to take the current year first quarter value and subtract that from the previous year's first quarter value. That quantity then I want to divide by the previous year's value. That gives me a percentage. I'm going to go ahead and decrease the decimals by using this little quick button here down to just a few. I don't need to see too many. I could increase it by 1 if I wanted to. Once I have it formatted the way I want it, I'll just double click on the autofill node and it will copy the format and the formula down, giving me my growth in GDP. I'm going to go back then and do that for real GDP, the same thing. I'll create growth. Got to go to the first quarter of 1948, and I'm going to take the quantity, the current period, minus the previous period, that quantity over the previous period, and that will give me my growth. I'll take that back a bit, double click. That gives me my two values now to plot on my graph. There are several ways to do this, but perhaps the most straightforward way, since we're going to deal with a lot of disconnected columns of numbers, is to just create a blank graph and then to add the appropriate series. So I'm going to move my cursor so that it's not bordering on any values. If it's bordering any values, Excel will try to create a graph for me using the wizard. I'll go up here and click Insert and select Chart. I'll move over here to the chart section, and I'm going to just create a line chart, very simple line chart. You'll see that since there was no data bordering my cursor, the chart is blank. When I've selected the chart, I get the Chart Tools menu. On the Design tab, I can select data, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to add some data. The data series that I want to add is growth and DEF, and I have to take the 1 out here. Excel has to put a 1 in. I'll select that first value, hold down the Shift key, press and release the N key, press and release the down arrow. That will select them all. I'll say OK. Now I can say OK and look at my graph, move my cursor back up. That's a start. We're not there yet. I'll click back on my graph, go to Select Data. I want to put my years in, so I'm going to edit my horizontal labels. And I'll select my years. Start with the first year that corresponds with the data that I have. I don't want to start up here. Hold down the Shift key, press and release the N key, press and release the down arrow. That selects all of those. I'll say OK. And I'll click OK to go back up here and take a look at my data. Looks a little bit better, but not quite there just yet. I want to add some more data. I want to add another series of values. And in this case, I'm going to go over here to the RGDB tab and select Growth RGDP. Take the 1 out. Could have just typed in equals there. Select my growth. Holding down the Shift key, press and release the down arrow. That gets them all. Say OK. And I'll say OK. And that gets me data that looks a lot better. I don't like where this horizontal axis is. So I'll click on the axis and then right click, select Format Axis. From here I'll go down and select Labels, and under Label Position I will select Low. That will move the labels down to the bottom so they're not in my data. Go ahead and close that. Now we're getting there. We can put some titles on, but we'll do all that in a minute. One of the things, though, I want to do is I want to overlay the recession years on this graph so that I can tell how GDP behaves during a recession. So I'm going to go back to Fred. And the data that I was working with is in quarters, if you recall. So I want to get the quarterly recession data for the United States. The Fred code for the quarterly recession data from peak to trough is USRECQM. Enter that, search. This is NBER-based recession indicators for the United States from peak through the trough. I'm going to go ahead and export that data. I'll export that to Excel. I'll go ahead and open this. This is a lot more data than I need. Again, I don't need to enable editing. I'm going to place my cursor on the first date value, hold down the Shift key, press the right arrow, press and release the end key, press and release the down arrow, and get them all. It goes all the way through the first quarter of 2014. Control C to copy that. I'll go to my workbook where I'm building my graph. I'm going to create a new tab, call it US Recession. Place my cursor right here in column 4 and do a Control V to paste. Paste that data. A couple of things to call your attention to. You'll notice that unlike in the previous examples, Excel does not convert this to a date, keeps it as text. It does that until it gets down to 1900. Now it reads that as a date value, because remember, Excel begins tracking dates at January 1st, 1900. So just before, it's treating it as text. Now treats it as a date. So I have my session data. I'll put a quarter here, quarterly. And here is my USRECQM value. So I'm going to go back to my chart. I have my chart selected here. Go back to design. I want to select another type of data. So I'll select data. I'm going to add a data series. I'm going to call this data series US Sessions. I'm going to move down here and type equals. Go over to my US Sessions. And I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to go ahead and scroll down to $1948, the first quarter, there it is. Place my cursor there, hold down the Shift key, press and release the End key, press and release the down arrow, and say OK. OK. Now that gives me an odd looking graph because the recession data is based on a value of 1 or 0, so 100% indicating the peak of a recession, 0 indicating the trough of a recession. So it's always going to 1, and this value very seldom gets above 0.2 or 20%. So what I need to do is include a second axis in my chart. So I'm going to go up and select Change Chart Type. Move down to Combo. I'm going to set the growth, GDP, DEF, make sure that's set to a line graph. Select the growth, RGDP, make sure that's set to a line graph. I'm going to introduce a secondary axis here. And I'm going to set US recessions to be a column. And say OK. That gives me an indication of where the recessions occur on the plot, the data that I have plotted. If I don't like these numbers in this secondary vertical axis, I can right-click on them, select Format Axis, and then under Labels, for axis position, I can select None. That will get rid of that for me without getting rid of the axis. If I delete it, it'll get rid of the whole axis. This allows me now to see a graph very much like the graph that Fred would make for you that shows how GDP is behaving with respect to the various recessions. Now, Fred would have solid bars here for the recessions because it does it a little bit differently, but this does accurately depict the presence of US recessions as related to GDP. If you want to add a title to this graph, you can go ahead and place the title above the chart, Growth in our GDP and GDP DEF. If you want to add a title to the vertical axis, axis titles, primary vertical, we might call this percent change from previous year. And we could add a primary horizontal axis, years. You can make other changes to this graph as you'd like, but this gives you a good way to evaluate your data.